Recording. And welcome everybody to the third and final live session for our November DevCamp. And today we are super excited to have Arthur joining us, who is going to be fielding the questions that you submitted on the forum in advance. And if we have time, additional questions that might come up. And we also have Philip, who was with us last time and who is on the HoloDev team joining us. And obviously, Micah is here with us, and me and Bear are going to facilitate. So thank you. And so if you have additional questions that come up, go ahead and put them in the chat channel. And part of what we'll be doing is reviewing those as we go and making sure that we can get to as many topics as possible in the time that we have allotted. And I did want to just check in and see how folks are doing now that we're at this point in this DevCamp. And for some of you, this is the second DevCamp, just to see like how things are going. We can use Eric or Bear's temperature gauge. Do you want to make some suggestions, Bear, about checking in on how folks are doing with?
Yeah, let's start with the obvious. Up here is I love Rust and I'm only going to code in Rust from now on. And down here is I'm still struggling with Rust, and here's like I'm learning it. I'm learning it. So where is everyone in that? All right. That's definitely progress. Let's see where everyone started. Where did you start 3 days ago in relationship to Rust? Yeah, below the screen. Can't even see the hands. Okay. And how about I'm going to do a little bit of questions. Does anyone have anything they want to know from the group? You're curious to know about this group? Someone typing? No? Yeah, all right. Cool. Yeah, that was great yesterday. I loved that too. Ooh, snap, Samuel. Good question. Okay, so I've learned over the course of this DevCamp that our community is, for lack of a better word, improving in quality. Like there are people showing up, like you as a group of people represent a high degree of skill, understanding, and self-determination. And that I've witnessed that grow in the people that are showing up. And it's really exciting to see that. So one of the things that I take that as a signal that what we're doing is working, because we're attracting more and more people that are clearer and that have higher levels of skill to come to the project and to engage with it. And you seem to have a lot of autonomy and like clear about what you want and asking questions. And that's really solid too. So that to me is what I'm learning, is that things are working, I guess, basically, and that we're growing, and that that makes me happy. I learned that makes me happy. How about you, Mickey? What did you learn in this DevCamp?
Well, I learned how to install Holochain on a Windows machine. Yeah, that was fun. And it was not fun, but I enjoy being able to learn new things. So I guess that part was fun. What else did I learn? I don't know that this is a learning as much as a reminder that I love working with developers. Even though I don't write code myself, it's always been something that I have enjoyed. I really like observing the process of smart, committed people trying to figure out how to solve a problem to make something better, and then like working together around how they're going to make that happen. And not just the like brilliant ideas and fixes, but also like the squidgy kind of things that sometimes happen as like as a thing that just needs to take place. And I love that process of co-creative problem solving. And so for me, because I do a lot of like operational business stuff for Holo, which I enjoy, but can also get boring, being here with this group of our community to me is very energizing. Yeah.
Great.
Thanks for letting us share.
Yeah. Thanks
Yeah.
for asking. So should we get into it?
Yeah.
Get to just pointing questions at Art and letting them rip?
Yep. Are you ready, Arthur?
Except for being able to unmute myself, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, good luck with that. I think what we've sort of organized the questions into questions about holochain, questions about holo hosting, and then questions about Scepter. So I think we're going to go sort of in that direction of like the more specific detailed things, and then get to bigger picture stuff about Scepter. Does that sound good to everybody? Okay. So the first question is about, well, I'm just going to read the question. Art, are you ready? I understand that zones are typically different sets of functionality within a single HAP, but I'm curious about how exactly a meta HAP would work. So essentially a HAP that relies on functionality from other HAPs to work. What would the equivalent of an API contract between the HAPs be? And at what level of the architecture would they be communicating? Is this kind of approach something that would be easy or advisable, or would it be best to keep all app functionality isolated into a single HAP?
So I don't, how much have you guys covered about bridging? Since I'm coming in at the last minute here, you talked about application bridging. Zero. I'm seeing zeros. Okay. So the basic gist is that holochain apps have a main security model that you probably haven't talked about at all yet. Have you talked about capabilities tokens for being able to address permissions? No, probably not. All right, so let me back up. There are some different schools of thought about security and being able to provide access to things. And probably the kind of security most of you have used before in operating system space and stuff is access control lists, where you have groups of people, or you have people that may be organized into groups and levels of control that you give to different sort of directories and resources and all that kind of stuff. There's a bunch of geeks that feel like this is an inherently evilly flawed approach to security, that it leads to something known as the confused deputy problem, because it lets certain things manage security for other things, and they have no idea how to do that. And what I mean by that is, like, imagine you were talking about an operating system. I'm giving maybe too much background here, but I'm hoping it's helpful. You're talking about an operating system where you have a compiler installed. You have access to running that compiler. That compiler has access to some directories that maybe you don't have access to. You tell it to compile something and overwrite a file in one of those directories, and now you've just basically used the compiler to circumvent security that was being enforced on you, but it had different enforcement on the compiler. And this is where it gets called a confused deputy, in that you sort of deputized the compiler to do a task for you, and it had no idea that it was doing something that might be a breach of security. So we happen to also like capabilities tokens, and that's kind of the unified model that we're using for security for holochain apps. So for example, you may know that you can write public entries to your local chain. You can also write private entries to your local chain. And then you could give selective access to those entries by committing a little token that says, for this user, I will let them read these things that other people can't read, right? And so you're giving very explicit access, in this case, read access. Read makes it sound like it's the access control list. We'll get a little bit further here. You can also put a capabilities token in that ends up being basically it's like an API call. So we have this app, and we're going to put in a capabilities token that says that this other app can call these functions. You can list which functions it can actually call into, and and that other app has basically an ID that it's calling from, a user ID that it's calling from. So you can check everything through cryptographic signing to be able to enforce that it is the person you're intending to be using the token who's actually using the token, and then they make calls into the functions that you want to make calls into. So that's a really long answer, but it's a way of saying that that's the unified security model that we're using for API bridging between apps, for exposing private data to other users on the network or to other apps, for exposing functions to particular interfaces, UIs, or things like that. So you could, for example, create, instead of an inward-facing localhost type of thing, you could create an outward-facing web port, web socket that you're exposing, and then make only allow read-only functions to that port, where like you have maybe full admin access to the internal localhost port, because you can actually say which functions in your app are callable when somebody comes in through this capabilities token. It gives you a massive amount of granularity for being able to connect things. And anyway, so in answer to the question about a meta app and how do you combine functionality of these things, we're trying to make it easy to combine these things by being able to provide a unified approach for putting these kind of API call bridges in place through a capabilities token, so that it actually can be really easy to connect functionality across apps. That's at the level of apps talking to each other. Then you also have the level of a UI that may be talking to multiple apps. Sometimes the app doesn't need to know about the other app, but the user needs to know about both apps. So you can create a UI that calls into multiple apps. Suppose you think of it like you have a Twitter and a Facebook, and you just make a social post UI that lets you, that the UI can actually post to each of those, but those two things don't know about each other at all. They don't need an API bridge to each other or anything like that. So those are some of the approaches for kind of making a meta app. You can do it at the UI level, and you can do it at the level of API bridging as well. I don't know whose question that was. Did that actually answer the question at hand?
It was Eric's question, and there were a couple of other yes, I want to know more about this sort of meta apping. Michael commented, can we name these entry rules contracts?
I would be hesitant just because of the smart contract overloading expectation in the space of calling them contracts. I mean, they are a kind of access contract, you could say. But the reason that it's maybe not that kind of contract is that the issuer can revoke the token at any time. So I can give you access to some things, but it's my things. I can revoke that token. A contract tends to not be single-side revocable in that same sense. So contract's probably not the right way to talk about it. And Philip, actually, who's on the call, has done a bunch of this stuff in demoing things both on the old version and started to try to do some of this on the new version, although we don't really even have all the API bridging in place yet on the Rust version. Did you want to add anything to that, Philip?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, this is exactly how we're using the idea of Vault, which manages our profiles and personas. So that's a separate app altogether. And then any app that wants to use kind of data in a profile will eventually use the bridge to call into Vault to get that value out. So it's exactly like that. And that's the Holochain UI project you can have a look at. Other question to you, Art, was, are we going to do the mix-ins idea still?
Are we going to do the mix-in what?
Now, in the prototype, we had this idea of mix-ins, which was like common code copied around. I didn't particularly like it. I was just wondering if
Yeah,
was another way of
mix-ins.
sharing code.
Well, we're still going to be doing mix-ins, but they're going to be easier because they can mix in by zome, because zomes are units of composability now, and they're going to be easier to drop in. You don't have to like do the handful of different things you had to do to mix in a mix-in before.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
So also on that Holochain UI project, we've now got the Rust container running inside its container and then accessing it via a WebSocket now too. So you can see how that's all done.
Cool.
Thank you. Bear, were you gonna take the next question? Or do you want me to keep asking?
You can keep asking, unless it makes it happy for me to do it with you.
Great. So next question is there an updated version of the HoloCurrency white paper on the way?
There's certainly supposed to be. I have not actually gotten that done. It turned into, so the original white paper turned into splitting it between the currency white paper and the Holo hosting white paper. I never even published the hosting white paper, never finished that one, and people didn't seem to quite notice. That's an incomplete white paper out there as well. When I went back to revamp this white paper, it really also started breaking into two currency white papers. One that really has to do with more the currency design concepts in terms of how it is that it's anti-speculative and how it's backed by hosting and sort of like how it's a different economic function. And the other one had to do with its scalability, with being able to, like, how it is that we're optimizing it for being able to do billions of micro hosting transactions a day without creating any bottlenecks. And it seemed like those two themes were becoming independent enough that it should become two different papers. And I began separating it out into two different papers and never finished the task. Sorry. So it's supposed to be forthcoming. We think that at some point in the future, once everybody realizes how this stuff works so differently than blockchain and they want to like go back and figure out how it works, that would probably be really smart for us to have these things published in live, that these may be meaningful papers to people. Unfortunately, we tend to be more focused on just building the things than writing about them. And I think we're trying to address that both on the level of marketing and documentation and technical specs and technical papers and stuff. So, yeah.
Cool.
But meanwhile, we still want to build it.
Thank you. Next question. I'm launching a mobile app and the agent-centric perspective of Holochain is just perfect for my use case. What's the estimated time frame before I can reliably use Holochain as my data layer?
There's two different parts to that answer. One has to do with reliable, and the other has to do with stable, as in unchanging. I think that there's some degree of reliability that actually the prototype version in Go even had, and that's, there are some sites out there that actually went ahead and launched things on the Go version, even though we said, hey, we're rebuilding this and your apps aren't going to work in the new version moving forward. They're going to be done differently. And what we're trying to do is to get a stable HDK, a stable language set in the Rust version made for the open alpha launch of Holo. I'm not sure we will have it in place for the closed alpha launch of Holo, which we're trying to get in place in January, and so that we can get at least some of the hosting functionality of Holo. I don't know how much you guys have talked about the difference between Holochain and Holo, but Holochain is a neutral peer-to-peer. When I say neutral, I mean there's no currency in it like most blockchains have a coin or token built in. Holochain doesn't, as you probably all know at this point. Holo does have a currency, and it's kind of our first big commercial application to run on top of Holochain. And it is basically setting up for Holo to be kind of the Airbnb of the cloud hosting space, to, in the same way that Airbnb sells more room nights than the largest hotel chains, but it's never built a hotel. We think we can compete on the level of the Amazons, Googles, Azures without ever building a data center by using Holochain to tap into existing peer-to-peer computing power, and be able to bridge that to web users. So all of that being said, Holo, it needs to build on top of the Rust version. We just had a Holo retreat this last week and started doing that with the release that was released for your DevCamp. And there's still some features missing for us to move forward, as you may have also discovered, some of the networking features and all that kind of stuff. But it's our intention to be able to build these Holo features by sometime in January, and hopefully have stabilized the HDK by that time as well, so that you'll have stable HDK with reliable enough features that we're actually building a big commercial app on it. So it should be safe for you too.
Thank you. Follow-up question about that. Is Holo what will resolve DNS to active nodes or Holo ports?
Can I just say something, Phil? What would be really cool is if people actually started building what they think are going to be production level apps now, because now you get to say how we build Holochain for you, okay? Because if you wait till we're done and you want something, yeah, but if you push for it now and show why it's a useful developer thing or something really useful in the app, in the platform, you more than likely get it. That's what I'm doing.
Yeah. And really, that's also what the Holo team is doing. Holo is sort of the first customer for Holochain, in that Holo, did the ICO, raised funds, and is the thing funding Holochain. In that sense, it's the paying customer, right? So the Holo dev team is setting a bunch of requirements and specs for the Holochain team, so that we can actually deliver the things that we need. So Philip's on the right track. This is a good time actually to jump in, because now we're actually on Rust, and the features are gelling right now. This is a good time to get some feature requests in the pipeline.
Cool. So back to that question. Is Holo what will resolve DNS to active nodes or Holo ports?
Sorry. Yes. Holo, as it talks about in the white paper some, is semi-centralized because we're having to interact with a semi-centralized web. What I mean by that is things like DNS and potentially sometimes, there's a bunch of things. How much detail do we want to go into here? Yes, Holo will resolve DNS, but it'll, yeah, I'm just going to stop there.
Okay.
Before I go into too much detail.
Cool. These are good questions. Okay, could we point an IPv6 for a domain A record towards a Holo instance?
Yeah, we will support IPv4 and IPv6, and ideally, once we get Holochain's networking, peer-to-peer networking protocol to be transport agnostic, truly transport agnostic, we'd also like to support some mesh networking protocols and stuff. But we're going to start off focused on v4 and v6, and someday we'd love for these Holo ports and stuff to actually help launch mesh networks, because what better way to do a mesh, a sort of peer-to-peer internet, but with a peer-to-peer application framework.
And how are Holochain and IPFS connected?
We like IPFS, feel like they're kind of a cool cousin crypto project, we, in the first version of Holochain, used libp2p, which is their peer-to-peer networking library. And the thought was we could have sort of friendly, compatible networks that could talk to each other. In the new Rust version, we actually have used a newer version of libp2p for prototyping, but I don't think we're sticking with it because it doesn't do a bunch of the things that we need for reliable connection through lots of layers of NAT or firewalls, and being kind of network topology agnostic, and doing HTTPS masquerading and a few other things that I think that we need. And it's pretty heavy and slow for what it gives us. There are some lighter options that we can pull some parts of and build our own parts of, and we have one of our team members working on that. So IPFS is a cool project. Love Juan Benet, but they're, as says in the name, interplanetary file system. They're more focused on kind of a file system and a permanent web, and we're focused on dynamic applications. And we're tending toward being more sort of lighter weight, fast. We also push data out to make it resilient in the data store and the DHT. They have a DHT, but they essentially use a kind of tracker on it, and they don't push data out using IPFS. Filecoin, they don't do it that way either exactly in Filecoin. So there's a bunch of similarities, but there's also some differences. I think of it more like Holochain's oriented toward being a crypto database, and IPFS is more oriented toward being a crypto file system.
Cool. I want to get into holo hosting a little bit more, if that's cool. So next question. When a host is providing a local chain for a non-holochain app user through Holo, would that user still be able to bridge apps and things like that? And then there are several questions in this series. If two different applications are both served out through Holo, how would the host know that a user is the same one on both applications? And would the user's local chain be replicated to many hosts in order for that user to have a coherent experience between apps and sessions, even though the host that they have been served by previously is offline?
So I'm going to start with the end of those questions and work my way backward. So a end user source chain does live on a host. None of the hosts have the user's authoring keys with which to write things to that chain, but they have the ability to serve out that chain to other nodes on the network when that person closes their browser. Because obviously you can't count on somebody's browser being online, not to mention browsers don't really like taking inbound connections. So they're not really optimized for a peer-to-peer networking application framework like Holochain. So you have a host that's fulfilling that role for you, and there are multiple hosts that will probably start off being actually a fixed number, and probably a small number that's holding your chain, probably like 5 or 8 hosts or something like that. At the moment, what we've been mocking with is 5. Because hosts are generally going to be, source chain hosts are generally going to have high uptime, so they will be online. When it comes to bridging between apps and how do you know which user is using which app and that type of thing. All right, I'm going to jump into a couple of the technical details of Holo. What we're doing with Holo, you know how Holochain has this thing that they've been calling the container, which can run multiple applications in it. We're building a different, I don't love the word container, unfortunately, because there are other places where we're actually needing to use containment in a way that like it's usually used. So we're building a Holo host container, which has a couple of different modes that the Holochain one may not have. And when you're running in a hosting mode, so the host may personally, as a user, use that container for running personal apps in the owner space, if you will. And then they would have the hosting space, which they can install apps, or they can set apps up to be installed, or they can even run kind of an autopilot, which lets the network tell them what apps there's a hosting demand for, and automatically install those apps. Those apps run in a multi-user mode, which initially sets up in an anonymous user space, sort of a web gateway space where the UI, whatever is configured as the default UI, where the UI files go. And so any user that doesn't have a permissioned session, meaning doesn't have something that they could be using to write to the source chain, they haven't entered into a write mode, they're in a read-only mode, all those users would be going through that anonymous space. So the way that we talk about this regularly is, so you launch Airbnb as a holochain app, you do some hosting through Holo, because you want grandma, who's not going to install a next-gen holochain app, crypto app, to be able to just type in a web address into her browser. So grandma types in fairbnb.org and gets served out your holochain app as an anonymous user by a sort of randomly selected host. We can come back to the sort of randomly selected in a bit if you have a question about that. That host is serving that out of the anonymous container at the moment. But then grandma decides she wants to book a room, and she clicks on book a room, and suddenly she's like, oh, okay, now I have to create a user account, like enter my email and password and that kind of thing. The thing is, we don't actually want her password. She's not really actually creating a password. She's using the password as part of a randomness to generate keys, because we do everything in holochain with keys. So we're actually generating keys that are being stored in her browser, and on the host side, they spawn a source chain for her in a different user container space. So back to the original question, in grandma's user container space, apps could be bridged between each other in that user container space. They can't be bridged across user container spaces. So I'm trying to work my way back to the original questions about the bridging. What was I feel like I'm missing one of the first questions.
It was about when a host is providing a local chain for a non-holochain app user, would that user still be able to bridge apps and things like that?
Yes, inside of their user container on that host.
And then if two different apps are both served out through Holo, how would the host know that the user is the same one on both applications?
Cryptographic keys.
Great.
That we use grandma's email and password as salt to generate keys, along with there's another bit of randomness, because passwords aren't random enough. Anyway. Cool. So she's generating keys without knowing it. And, the good thing about that is we're trying to make this really accessible to people without doing, having to buy special wallets and all that kind of stuff. The bad thing is people expect to do things like, oh, I want to reset my password. And we're like, yeah, we can't. If you forgot your password, you can't regenerate your keys, and we don't know them. So yeah, we're trying to find a healthy compromise between making this accessible to end users without altering their expectations too much. But there are certain things that we can't really responsibly do. We can't really responsibly transmit private keys over the wire, or have us be collecting them or something like that. So
can you say more about how you're going to be approaching that, since grandma won't know, as C says, that that's not possible?
Well, we will probably actually tell grandma what's happening at the time she creates the account, but people don't read that stuff. So even if we say we can't set, if hold on to this password. We can't reset your password for you. This is being used for you to generate keys. People just go, yeah, whatever, and click OK. So we're just trying to be realistic about the fact that even if we tell you that, we're not expecting most people to actually understand or remember that happened.
Mm-hmm. I'm just chuckling because Thomas is saying we should just put a chip in everyone's head. Also, I have a request that maybe we refer to the end users as grandpa, not just grandma. Mix it up a little. It's not just the old lady.
Old ladies, grandmas are just usually sweeter than grandpas, and I like them more.
Okay, good. And then there's a little bit more about user stuff and security and filtering that we want to get into. Most of us, will be grandpas. But one more comment from Nels about this is, could you somehow have Holo keep track of her identity as an email address and generate a key for her? And then for her to regain access, Holo can send an email with an access code.
Muted on the hardware. Yes, and we will be keeping track of a salt that's associated with her email, the randomness that we generated. But I'm not on board with taking people's private keys or having them transmitted over the wire at all yet. Most of our guys, are like, this is a crypto no-no. You don't do that. And so we are, in fact, holding some of the randomness to generate her password. Personally, I think if we do this right, then we don't have password constraints and we don't have email constraints. You don't have to worry about running into a collision with somebody, and we don't say, you have to make your password be blah 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 blah, and that has people write passwords that they can't remember. And so I'm just really hoping, if we don't constrain people in that way and we give them a chunk of randomness that we're holding on to, that is hashed with their password as the salt that then generates the keys and blah blah blah, that people can remember their password if they had no constraints. So far, we don't want to be responsible for holding people's passwords. Keys or passwords for that matter. We'll see.
Okay.
There will probably be multiple implementations of this at some point.
Well, so there's a couple of questions. One about fairness and like capital market BS, and then another one that's more about just bad actors. So let's start with a fairness question. How will the distributed hosting handle fairness? We want to build commons markets on top of Holochain, but could see bias introduced, whether deliberately or not. An example of indeliberate bias is continued selection of a seller with steady supply and a good reputation that ends up not giving new players a fair go. The more capitalist approach is deliberately creating a monopoly by undercutting and squeezing out smaller suppliers with loss leaders. So do we have algorithms or foresee like how to handle this in Holo? And what is our suggestion for HAPs that create markets?
All right. So first, on the fairness side, there's a certain kind of unfairness, if you will, to the hosts that I think will be endemic in their performance. The good news is that different apps will have different priorities around this stuff. So the way things work right now, hosts can choose what apps they want to host. App providers can choose what criteria they have around hosts. So there are certain things where it's like, if you have an app that a governmental department in Canada is running, it happens to be a requirement that if you are a Canadian governmental department, you have to have your data hosted in Canada. You can't use apps that host you elsewhere. So you would put, as that app provider that's running this, you would put a constraint that the hosts have to be located in Canada, for example. Another app might have you might be doing healthcare information and might say that the hosts have to have a HIPAA certification. Other apps maybe just be doing a wiki and may have no filters along those lines, but instead be prioritizing cheapness, right? They're saying, I want the cheapest hosts. And other ones may be saying, I have a CPU intensive app and I need apps that have high CPU power. So basically the app providers are setting certain filters and priorities about host performance. Each day we tranche those, let me back up. Holochain apps automatically, through gossip, collect some information about other apps. About other hosts, because part of how they manage the resilience of the DHT and that there's enough copies of the data out there is that they check to make sure, are these hosts that are holding that still there as part of their gossip, and what's their uptime? How many times when I ask if they're there, do they respond? Yes, I'm here. And that lets us weight it lets us see percent uptime basically of the host so that we can adjust how many copies are on the network to meet the resiliency requirements. With Holo, we're adding a couple of more features, both self-reported by hosts and confirmed by responsiveness and stuff by other hosts. So we're getting aggregate performance data about hosts that are across all apps, but that is used to help us tranche hosts in different sort of service levels. So this is the first tranche. Think of this like, securities tranches. There's a AAA rating, there's a, whatever. But tranche 1 is the hosts that meet this app's requirements the best. And then tranche 2 is the next clustering of hosts and so on. And so then depending on the demand volume of requests coming, first they're being served out of tranche 1. If we have too high a demand for tranche 1 to service, they fall to tranche 2 and that kind of thing. And the way that they're randomized within the tranche is actually by hash of the request. So the request comes in signed and with a timestamp, and then we hash that request and we take a modulo. Let's say there was 58 hosts in tranche 1, take a modulo 58 to determine which is the lead host that this gets served to. So every day we recompute the tranches for each app, and while things are being served out, it becomes randomized in one of those predictably random, in other words, repeatably random ways. So we know that people also can't falsify their traffic, which is part of making sure that app providers aren't being defrauded by hosts just sort of agreeing to send each other traffic to try to inflate their hosting bills. So I think this ends up being fair because it randomizes within performance levels or within fit levels. It's not just performance. And the app provider gets to say what the fit is. So if they care most about the service being cheap, or if they care most about it being, there's a bunch of different criteria. I could link you to the criteria that you can set right now. But those tranches aren't going to be the same across all apps. Apps are going to end up having different tranches, and not all hosts are going to be hosting all apps either. So I think it ends up being a good way to mix it all up. However, we may find that there are some hosts that are on super slow connections in, I don't know, in rural India or something like this, that and they may not end up getting much direct hosting traffic routed to them. But one of the roles that they can play still is part of the data resilience in terms of gossip and backups. But that is an asynchronous thing where you're not shaping an end user's experience by having to wait for things to upload through their slow connection in rural India. So that's one of the other roles that hosts can play.
Cool. Quick follow-up question about that. What if people clear their browser sessions? Does that mean that they're logged out, or does it identify the computer in another way?
If they were to clear their local store, then they would lose the keys that they generated, but we would still hold the salt. So if they know the email and the password that they used, we can hand them back the randomness that we generated for the salt, and we can regenerate their seeds and they can reconnect.
Cool. And then can you now speak to just this idea of bad actors or illegal content or apps that end up on the network, and how those things will be addressed?
Yeah, so there's a couple things about that. First of all, I just want to remind everyone, probably all know this, but every holochain app is a separate peer-to-peer network, right? Like, so, if there's something bad happening on one app, it doesn't affect other apps. Their DHTs are separate, their content is separate, their network is separate encryption. So you can't bring down the whole thing anyway by seeding bad stuff into it. The other thing that I want to point out is holochain is good for a lot of things, but not so good for anonymity. So it's not an ideal place to perform illegal activity, even though it's good for privacy, right? Like, you can run a private network. You could say, okay, there's a group of people going to create a child pornography ring, and nobody else even knows about this network running, except for the fact that if anybody ever pierces their membrane, if one of their members decides, has a change of heart, if an undercover police officer gets in or whatever, then all of their actions and their history are cryptographically signed that they've taken those actions. So you kind of leave, in some ways, the perfect trail of evidence that leads back to you as people are like gossiping back and forth with each other's IP addresses or something like that. It doesn't mean we know your real world identity, but it means that there's accountability for your actions. They're all cryptographically signed and probably, again, associated back to an IP address, and the police can trace that through whatever means they can. VPNs and stuff have started cooperating with police on this stuff. So it's harder and harder to hide your tracks. And holochain, I think, is a horrible way to hide your tracks. It's just that you can be private for as long as you are. Does that answer the question? It's not a platform that would encourage people to post illegal things, because it leaves a pretty strong record of where it came from.
Yeah, that is helpful. Thank you. Okay. Another question that's come up around holoport hardware is, will holoports be optimized for hosting? That is, if we run holo software on our random hardware, will that likely have a significantly slower performance than on a holoport?
Well, like the holoport plus in particular, we have optimized for what we expect to have happening in hosting, and that it has a lot of RAM and an SSD to spill over for swap space, and then storage. And you could always plug in NAS devices onto your network or through USB or whatever for slower storage even still. I think Holo will work fine on other devices, and I suspect actually that there's going to be a lot of people that end up doing this in data centers, or even sometimes in virtual cloud settings, just to run small instances. we've definitely tried to optimize the hardware per our expectations of what it's going to be without having we hadn't even written the Rust version yet. But how many things you can host simultaneously is probably going to be a pretty RAM intensive issue. It's going to be a function of how many of these chains you can load up simultaneously and how many apps you can be holding simultaneously in memory to be servicing these requests. So you can run it on other computers, but you probably want to boost up your RAM as a starting point. Swap space as a second point.
Cool, thank you. Thomas wants to know if there's a plan to move away from email. Is there ever a plan to move away from email?
I was really resistant to having email be the way that people might put their information in at all, but it's like a super light KYC that can also send people reminder for later, and it's really hard to make email compatible with Holochain, frankly. The way that you have to really do it to have it be compatible with Holochain is when you set up your Holochain container, you put in your email credentials for one of your own accounts, and you become your own email relay. You use one of your accounts, logs into your Gmail account to send yourself an email, and everybody sends themselves their own email, right? Because if we make any kind of centralized way of doing this, then it becomes a spam gateway, essentially. It would be hard to keep people on the network from doing this. So we are definitely moving away from email, but we may, for Holo, not Holochain, but Holo web users, still have email be a part of how they set up their credentials, because it is a fairly nice, unique identifier that can actually be easy to verify that they're in control of that identifier.
Cool. Thank you. Now, there were a bunch of questions about some timeline, a bunch of questions about Scepter. And before we get into talking about Scepter or even the timeline for Holo and Holochain, are there any other specific technical questions related to these or other topics? I don't want to miss something. I know there's a lot happening in the chat. Okay, can you just speak, Art, to the timeline for other programming languages for Holochain apps?
For other programming languages?
Yeah.
Hang on, I'm seeing a question in the chat about before mesh networking comes online, is there a danger of telecom companies or governments access? And let me just answer that one before we move on. It is our intention to have an HTTP masquerading mode for the P2P library that we're working on. And what that means is it would be very hard for a telecom to be able to differentiate you making an outbound connection via HTTPS from any other web request. You can't do deep inspection of the traffic. It's going to be wrapped inside of an SSL request if you're running in masquerading mode, and that should be an option. And it would be, in fact, the way Holo users, web users, would be making a web request, as far as ISPs can tell. It's just Holo chain users would also start to do that if there were a reason. That's going to be a configuration option once we have that set up in our P2P networking. Does that answer that question? So the answer is, sorry, let me just acknowledge, telecom ISPs are a weak point. They are, we talk about Holochain being an unenclosable carrier, but that depends on us being able to connect to the same carrier. And at the moment, internet protocol is the way that we do that. And that's in almost everywhere controlled by either a monopoly or a pseudo monopoly of telco providers. So that is definitely a weak link in the chain at this stage. And that's part of why we are committed to supporting mesh networks and that other kind of stuff. But we also are committed to having masquerading and ways of having this basically be undetectable as well.
Cool.
So sorry, back to your other question. Now I've forgotten it. Can you just remind me?
When can we write things in Holochain, not in Rust?
Right. I think we're going to have WebAssembly pretty quickly for a JavaScript type of thing. I mean, we've already been working on the HDK for that. The problem has been WebAssembly isn't very mature. Sorry, not WebAssembly, AssemblyScript. I always do that. I always say WebAssembly when I mean AssemblyScript. I mean, just to give you a sense of its immaturity, one of the problems we ran into is that AssemblyScript, which is a version of JavaScript that's supposed to compile to WebAssembly, didn't support interfacing with JSON as a data format.
That's a problem.
JavaScript didn't support JavaScript object notation, so go figure. Now, we've put in a request with them about that. They've actually said that they're going to add that feature, and we were afraid we were going to have to do that. Looks like they're doing that, and but the timing on this seems like it's not just in our hands. Connor's actually on the call right now, and both Connor and Philip, I think, have worked on the AssemblyScript HDK. Do you want to voice anything about that?
Can y'all hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, it is a little bit of a waiting game in terms of like the particular features that we're missing in AssemblyScript to be able to fully implement it. We got quite a ways through. We have a bunch of the HDK aspects complete. At the same time, there's lots of them that aren't complete too, and we decided at the time just prior to DevCamp 1 to focus our energy on really strong and complete support on the Rust HDK, and until we get a clear signal on the timing of the JSON kind of blocker in AssemblyScript, we're going to be we'll still be kind of holding off on development for the AssemblyScript thing. However, we are in communication with them, and we're hoping to see something come together.
I know that for me personally, I'm a little worried about, we're trying to support basically a web stack with Holo, and most web developers don't know Rust, and so having a JavaScript that they can use seems to me like it's kind of critical path for us. As far as other languages go, there are other languages that do compile successfully to WebAssembly, but we would need to write a little the HDK extensions for that language. And I know that there's been some interest voiced in that around things like, C# and Unity and C++. But I'm not in any rush to write those. Maybe that is a way that there could be community participation, but yeah. Hopefully after we put a couple of these HDKs out there, people can see how you can write your own bridge in that regard for anything that compiled to AssemblyScript.
Cool.
Sorry, anything that compiled to WebAssembly. See, I keep doing that. Switching those two.
Cool, thank you. Okay, I think I want to dive into some questions about Scepter. One, can you define Scepter as simply as possible? Yeah, I was looking forward to asking you that question.
If imagine if computers had not emerged from this von Neumann linear concept of a paper tape that you can run your program on and your data on, but everything is like linear data. Imagine instead computers evolved in the same kind of fractal surface area space that nature runs on. And then we invented all of computing from there on top of that kind of architecture. Essentially, I think what you would get is Scepter. I mean, that's how we got to Scepter, was reinventing computing based on the patterns of scalability that we see in nature, the patterns of processing, the patterns of sense making, the patterns of signaling on protocols and carriers, in the way that we're doing right now. Like I'm pushing air through my vocal cords and shaping my mouth to make sounds, create sound waves. And if you were in the room with me, no digital media would be required, you know, for us to be communicating. And we patterned Scepter in that same way. So Scepter is short for receptor. A receptor is a lightweight virtual machine, and they have the capacity to be fractal, meaning you can put them inside of each other. And each one is a small computing space of integrity, where there's particular kinds of meanings and relationships and symbols and structures defined, and then it communicates both inward and outward with its membrane, through its membrane, to other receptors it contains or to other receptors that contain it. If I would have to go with that as the simplest definition, but what it gets you is some really cool stuff, like self-describing protocols that are pluggable and nestable and chainable, so that really anything can talk to anything, instead of having the kind of very brittle communication architectures that we have in the world today. I mean, one of the other ways that I think of Scepter in this receptive capacity is that it's kind of like the feminine rewrite of our computing architecture, right? It focuses on the receptive first, rather than the thing sticking out into the world, the signals, or I don't know. I could go on to explain this lots of different ways, but it's tends to be a tangle for people.
Well, there's some follow-up questions, but before we get into more of the detail of that, how did you come up with the idea of Scepter?
Well, Scepter came out of the Metacurrency project, and the Metacurrency project really started with what was a fairly simple goal. Two people should be able to interact, you could say transact, with each other without being constrained by any third party not of their choosing. In the crypto space, we call that trustless, we call that decentralized, we call that, but it was for us just starting with, we should be able to interact with each other without being forced through another intermediary. And that sounds simple and obvious, but you've got services out there like PayPal that claim to be a peer-to-peer payment processing system, right? All you need is an email address. Well, there's a bunch of layers there that are not so peer-to-peer, even an email address, right? Most people don't run their own mail servers, so they are already under somebody else's control in that kind of namespace. It's a domain name, which is under a centrally controlled, although delegated authority to registrars namespace. And to talk to the system at all, you have to get an IP address, also a centrally controlled address space, although delegated to ISPs, and in terms of assignment, and you're using a centrally controlled currency. Although there's all of these stacks of things that make it not so much a peer-to-peer payment system. And we were looking at, how does this architecture need to be rewritten in a way that is not built on all of this centralization, And where we looked was to nature. And in particular, what we learned a lot from was language and humans. Like, how is it that that we can compose in this space and you can understand me? I can wordify in ways you've never heard and you can understand, or I can regrammarate in a Yoda-like manner and you'll still understand. And, like, there's something very resilient about this that's very different about how we do normal computing. And that's how we ended up having that breakthrough about that receptive capacity, that it doesn't start from the same ontological frame that most computer science you learn to design from. And I'm going to stop there because otherwise I may go on another 10 minutes.
So concerning Scepter, is it correct to think of it as a meta layer allowing all the holochains to communicate? Or what is it beyond that?
We can't build Scepter on top of holochain because Scepter changes the underlying fabric from linear memory representations to semantic trees. So holochain is a part of Scepter. Scepter has different types of receptors, some of which are multi-instance receptors, where each of us are running an instance that synchronizes with each other. And we took that little multi-instance receptor synchronization pattern and took that out of Scepter and made a standalone version of it called holochain, built on existing sense making. Like, you can use the tools that you're used to and languages you're used to and data models you're used to, rather than have to learn semantic trees at the base layer, which nobody has ever used before. But it means we can't actually build Scepter on holochain. We'll have to rebuild holochain, the holochain type of pattern or synchronization into Scepter distinctly. But there's so much you get by putting these semantic trees at the lower layer that it's hard to even start professing the benefits. But we couldn't get we have a universal parser that comes out of it, the self-describing protocols, the self-eating trees that can run concurrently and across many processors, and whole bunch of things. So yes, Scepter would be like if you rewrote holochain in Scepter to have all the receptors be able to interact with each other and talk with each other and have self-describing protocols.
Aaron was commenting that Scepter semantic trees mentioned by Philip in the second session in here sound familiar to aspects of Rebol language and design, now open source. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I've looked at that system. They certainly are, if it's the one that I'm thinking of, that they certainly are, have created an interesting framework for creating domain-specific languages. But Scepter is weirder than that. I would assert that the way we build meaning in Scepter is the way we build meaning here in normal space, that we assemble things into a context and essentially label them in that context, signify them in that context. The same thing in a different context may actually be a different thing, even though structurally it's identical. Semantically it would be different, and we make it possible to do that with these semantic trees, where you have the structure in the tree architecture and the semantics in that every item stored in memory at any level of that tree, at not just the leaves, but at every node, has the semantics of it. So what that means is you can't store an integer in Scepter. You can store a use of an integer, a semantic use of an integer, like a shoe size or a street address or an age or something like that, but you can't store an integer. Obviously, it does store an integer, but there's this thing that we do that I don't think we realize that we do. It's like we construct meaning, and then we have the computer deconstruct it and lose it. And then we have to create another layer where we reconstruct it. And then we have the computer deconstruct it and lose it. And we create another layer where we do this many times throughout the whole computing stack. And I think we're screwing ourselves over, such that we're now getting all the way up to this layer where Tim Berners-Lee wants to do solid and do like semantic linked data on top of web type stuff, because we know that that's a super reliable and stable platform, because you never have broken links on the web or anything like that. And so what we're suggesting is that at the moment that the coder, the original programmer, made a piece of data, it had meaning, and it should never be separated from that meaning. That meaning is what defines that piece of data in terms of how it's used. And so what we do is we write programs, right? And as a programmer, we write code and we understand the construct we're building. But what's actually the way we record it is as characters, as ASCII characters or UTF characters, in a linear document. And so then a compiler or interpreter has to load these linear characters and try to reconstruct the programmer's mental model, right? So we then try to we scan through it and find all the lexical things, and then we parse it and try to reconstruct the structure and hope that what we're reconstructing is what the programmer intended, right? And we know about some of the gaps in that translation sometimes. And then, so we've compiled it, let's say, and now we want to debug it. Well, wait a second. We compiled it, so we stripped out all of the variable names and signifiers. Now to debug it, we have to re-wed them again back with the code to understand what this value was in this context. Now we want to present a user interface, right? Well, now we need to put a label on the field for the user, as if that should be different than it was originally intended by the programmer, or right, we have that for the database. We have the fields labeled in a database, and then we serve this out through a website, and now we make little micro tags for the labels in a web UI, and now we keep stripping out the meaning and having to re-tag it again, having to reassemble that meaning instead of just have it carry through. I'm now ranting at this point, I think, but there's something that you get by wedding this at the most base layer and never allowing that integrity to break, that I think will allow us to build layers and layers of expressivity much faster and much more interoperably. And I would assert it's part of why our existing computing architectures are so brittle.
And so can you, from there, just say more about what it is that you envision for Scepter? What shape will it ultimately take? How will we be interacting with it?
Well, let me just start first with Holochain, because if you've interacted with blockchain before, written contracts and Solidity, or tried to make two different blockchain systems talk to each other, and different things like that, you've run into the problems of this brittleness, of things being siloed, of things being having significant interoperability issues. And the idea that in Holochain you can just slap a capabilities token with API calls that gives another application the ability to call into this app, that creates a way of weaving things together that is virtually impossible in the blockchain space, as near as I can tell. So that I'm saying this as just one little glimpse of the level of interoperability or expressivity that becomes possible. But now imagine if one person writes an edge receptor for the Facebook API, then anything else in Scepter now can connect to the Facebook API. Any other application written in Scepter can interface with the Facebook API through the self-describing protocols. And the 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 resilience that this will give us in terms of information flows. Like I think of how horrible right now it is to manage large scale things. Like think about the CEO of a multinational corporation, who she gets a stack of 400-page binder dropped on her desk with all these reports of what's happening in the organization. And if she's lucky, there's, some graphs and charts to help make sense of the data. But like a lot of this stuff is financial, reports and words and language and all this kind of stuff. Well, what if you had everything so interoperable in terms of self-describing protocols that you could actually represent a view of this as a real-time living system, not a 400-page printed report, but like think of a digital representation of a living system like the aquarium screensaver. Do you guys who remembers the aquarium screensaver with the fish swimming around the screen? And all right, awesome. So imagine you could tune different species of fish to be different departments and divisions of the organization. And you can even do second order derivative or integral type behaviors of like, if the sales are going up at this one, then the fish is swimming higher. If the sales are going down, then the fish is swimming lower. The speed of the fish can be something else. The algae growing on the side of the tank, the lighting, the bubbles coming up, the currents going across. You have the ability to actually. We have the sensory information, sensory capacities to absorb millions of simultaneous data points at once when it's presented that way. So imagine you could just have, on a monitor on the wall, the health of the company right there, the health of the organization across the whole world, and you can look up there and see, oh wait, there's something going on with that division. Click on that fish, drill in, find out what's going on, whatever. And you have like an ever-present gestalt. And it doesn't just have to be the CEO in this case. What this allows is holopticism. Anybody could pop this up in the corner of their screen and pay attention to the parts that are relevant to them. And being able to have this kind of interoperability, I think is the only way that we really get to large-scale human collective intelligence to stop creating the kinds of problems that we're currently creating that basically destroy the planet, right? You can actually do a similar kind of representation of the health of the planet, environment, different things like that, and get faster feedback than waiting for the forest fires or droughts or, like the kinds of things that we actually need to be able to steward the things that we want to build together. And anyway, that's the end game as far as I'm concerned for Scepter, is being able to coordinate on those scales.
There was a question about that. Oh, right. So someone had said, I see Holochain as a tech that could enable the emergence of a resource-based economy. And is that what you intended to do?
It is somewhat like the Venus Project folks, and I'm not saying you're arguing for them in any case like that, but they tend to sort of skip over the whole part of that people don't believe other people's solutions. Like you could have somebody from the future come back and say, we finally figured out how to not kill ourselves. Here's the plan, and nobody will fucking believe them. Sorry, we're recording, aren't we? Shouldn't be swearing. Anyway, you're missing the whole kind of human part of you. Politics exist in part because of what it takes to bring about social change. I'm not saying politics is effective, but this is part of how we have ourselves in this tangle. And so yes, Holochain doesn't have a currency so that we can build other currencies on top of it as distributed apps. Holo is a currency backed by hosting power. We're already in partnership with other groups working on, actually, I saw Chris David on here just a few minutes ago. Is he off the call now? Yeah, anyway, he's working on being able to put a currency in place backed by transportation, sort of rideshare type thing, actually put Uber out of business with a distributed platform. and it's called Arcade City. We're working with other folks right now on food-backed currencies, energy-backed currencies. In that sense, a true resource-based economy in terms of some of the fundamental needs upon which you could actually build a responsible economy. Right now, our money system is decoupled from the world, from its impact on the world, from, and we grow abstract symbols hungrily, gambling on markets and that kind of thing without any real feedback into the effect on the system. But if the base of the currency in a particular domain is energy, food, housing, healthcare, transportation, hosting, or basically coordination, communication coordination ability, then we actually have strong building blocks for a real economy that is post-industrial, post-scarcity, post-fiat. And I mean that also by the fiat cryptocurrencies that dominate the space today.
Okay, one more question about this part, and then we're going to bounce back to a question about some of the data structure. Do you think that Holochain could revive democracy?
I hope that Holochain can transform democracy, because I don't think that really what we have is democracy. I think we need to kind of upgrade some of our views and get that representative democracy doesn't work on this scale, hasn't worked, may not work at all, that we need other forms of participatory governance, which you could call democracy, but that ride on significant upgrades in our capacities for collective intelligence and feedback loops. So I was giving the aquarium as an example of being able to see many feedback loops in almost real time, on large scale. That allows us to have different responsiveness, different self-governance than voting and lawmaking and that kind of stuff ever would. And I think that kind of stuff becomes possible out of this. Yes.
Okay, so do you know of any examples anywhere close to the kind of self-describing data that you talk about in Scepter in the current computing world?
Not really. I mean, there's a lot of attempts, right? There's JSON and XML, and there are formats that are supposed to be self-describing, but they are not exactly. They are they're ASCII text representations of ambiguous things that are not fully operationalized. They don't have. So let me rephrase this. Before there was Scepter, our previous iteration that we built a few iterations of things. The previous iteration was called XGFL. We were trying to, it was extensible game format language. We were trying to have people think of currencies not just as money, but as current seeds, these things that allow us to see currents and shape flows and interact in different ways. So you can think about games are often a way where there's like different things that let you see the state of the game, right? And there's markers, there's tokens, there's boards, there's there's complex things like American baseball, where 3 strikes is an out or 3 balls is a walk, and a foul at that point is and 3 outs is an inning, and did I say 3? 4 balls are a walk. Yes.
Yeah.
Where you have all these complex currencies interacting with each other that show you the pattern of the game, that shape the behaviors and all of that. Anyway, we wrote this platform. It was really cool. It's called the Flow Place, that you could plug XGFL-based currencies in. You could have currencies in there, lots of different ones, but they could not interact with each other. They did not interoperate. It turns out describing something in a static form, like a document format, like JSON or XML, we were doing an XML type of variant approach, isn't very intercomposable with other things and interactive with other things. And what we needed was this receptor. We needed this ability to receive and process and transform things at the level of the definitions itself, at the level of where those things live, so that other things could just plug into them or listen to them. And so you could run all of your other baseball stats, your fantasy baseball league or football league or whatever, based on the actual things happening by being able to plug in at the right level. You can't plug into XML. It isn't active. It's static. And so, yes, there are other attempts to do this, but I haven't really seen other attempts that make it a living thing. And it being a living thing is what it takes in order for it to actually have the composability. It has to run process.
Cool.
I don't know if any of that makes sense, but that's what we learned.
I think how are people doing in tracking? I think people are tracking well.
Oh yeah, where's Eric taking temperature checks?
Yeah. Good.
Yeah, that's pretty good. Paul's out of it though. Paul's not tracking.
Is anyone stuck anywhere? Like, you're losing me with this, or I just can't, I'm not getting this thing and I really want to.
Why do you keep talking about that? Why do you keep making fun of blockchain? Sorry.
Everyone's getting everything they need?
Well, so
no confusion. Great.
C's comment is Rust! Exclamation point, exclamation point.
You know, that's a little bit where we're stuck a bit too, in that, yeah, we spent this last week, the Holo dev team, who have built many Holochain apps on the old version. We're very clear about Holochain. We have experienced developers and all that kind of stuff, but not experienced with Rust for the most part. And we just watched our productivity grind to a halt on being able to just crank something out. Like, we had ways of being able to crank out an app in an hour or an afternoon, and it started turning into days. And so I feel you on the Rust. There's definitely a learning curve that we're confronting there as well. Part of what I tell myself about this, we'll see how this pans out, is that I'm saving future tech debt now by going through something that's so strict and, conservative on, memory and lifetimes and all that kind of stuff, that it's preventing future problems that I won't have to fix and we won't have to fix. So far, that's only slightly reassuring.
Cool. There's a couple of other currency related questions, and we'll see if these are short answers, and then we'll move into what's next. Fernando wants to know, what's the core idea about using currencies to reveal the flows from nature to human society and the other way around?
So again, I want to underscore the meaning of the word currency. The way that we use it in the Meta Currency project is...
Oh, he wrote it that way, but yes.
Yeah, that it's about current seas, the ability to see flows or currents. And it's not necessarily about trade. That reputation currencies, show, they repute certain levels of learning when you have a college degree in a particular domain and, different stuff like that. We walk around right now with actually extraordinary sensors, right? Like on our phones, we have all kinds of sensors. People have started adding some other things like air quality sensors, and, you can put water quality sensors out there. The ability for us to have sensors in the environment, even digital, not just our bodies and our awareness, is becoming extremely available, extremely cheap and available. But the problem is we don't have any ways of coordinating those data flows. We don't have ways of integrating them, and we don't have ways of having the sense making not be centrally controlled. The people who collect this data at the moment, like to hold the monopoly on that data. The GPS companies went out and bought up a bunch of these different traffic sensor companies so that they could get traffic information for the GPSs. And then, Google went and bought Waze and just has your phone send them the traffic information. You just drive your sensor around for them. And and so I'm just pointing to that all that data, though, is siloed. But if you have a platform like Holochain or Scepter to be able to actually have it be held collectively, we can have all kinds of people learning from it real time, composing with it in different ways. One of the other little tricks with Scepter is listeners, is that receptors have scapes of relational information in them, and you can put a listener on a scape, listening for something that doesn't even exist yet, a particular relationship you define in terms of the relational values defined in that receptor. And then when that shows up later, it can notify you if that receptor has agreed to store that listener. And so we could listen in to each other's different things. I can plant a future request for information when that information shows up, and it starts turning the internet into a truly neural network fabric, being able to plant those kinds of listeners and be able to operate outside of those silos. So, yeah.
How do you think Holochain can handle the question of oracles for some HAPs? Is it linked?
Well, interestingly, I think this is one of those places where I make fun of blockchain for pretending that data has independent existence as tokens on, as if we stick an RFID chip on something, that somehow that's the same as the token on the chain or something like that. I would assert that all information translation between the digital space and analog space is happening under the agency of somebody, something, and it needs to be reported by that agency. That you can then decide, okay, the score of this game was reported by this many different people, or these people with this level of trust, or this team player, or that sports channel, or you can decide different levels of credibility to give to different agents, but no oracle will be true. It will only be an agent's representation of information. You decide whether or not you trust that agent, or how many agents, or what kind of triangulation you need from different agents to reach an acceptable truth threshold for you. And I feel like Holochain keeps that connection made in the way that it really works, because it's agent-centric like that. It's signed to somebody's chain. Somebody is asserting it. You can validate based on whatever level of additional assertions you need to cross some threshold.
So given the lower anonymity in Holochain, how would you gauge the danger of dedicated infiltrator crawlers penetrating different HAPs and aggregating the data? Like if you wanted to predict and work around something like that.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I suspect it will take them a little while to even figure out that such a thing is possible, and that really applications for the most part should be thinking about their membranes. Like what does it take to actually join this application? I suspect one of the weird things that's going to happen is that for HoloFuel, maybe not everybody knows this, for HoloFuel, we're intending to do KYC. Or rather, we're intending that there are KYC requirements. We're not intending to do much of the KYC. Same reason we don't want people's keys and passcodes. We don't want people's identities. But we want recourse for identity. For hosts, for example, they're creating a contractual relationship with us. You have to have gone through some KYC provider, and in the agreement with that KYC provider, if you do something fraudulent, you defraud us in some way or the network in some way, we may have the ability to then go get your information from that KYC provider to come after you. But we don't even want that KYC information to begin with. But the point of all of what I'm saying there is that I think there's going to be an interesting thing that happens if HoloFuel has a network of KYC providers that sign that this person has been, sorry, I realize a bunch of you may not know KYC. It's a banking term, know your customer. It has to do with, it's just like right now when you sign up on crypto exchanges, they have to like get your whatever, your passport, scan and, different things like that. They get a bunch of information from you to confirm you are who you say you are, for banking requirements for anti-money laundering, right? We're doing KYC for Holochain, but we will have many different KYC providers who provide different levels of certainty, and you get some KYC points, basically. We're not exposing any of the identity information or even storing that identity information. We're just showing that somebody has, and they've signed for that. Now, I think what that is going to end up meaning, this is a long answer to membranes, but I think what that's going to end up meaning is that if you have a HoloFuel account, then you're good to join this other thing. So, or if you have a certain level of KYC points that you've accumulated in HoloFuel, you have 5 points, you have 10 points, whatever it is, then you're good for joining this app as a shortcut for a bunch of other people not needing to do KYC because it's a pain in the ass. But I'm also hoping that if we set up this network of KYC providers, that they can also provide for other apps and stuff. It doesn't have to be a centralized thing if everybody goes through HoloFuel. But I'm betting that having a network of basically pseudonymous, right? It's a key, users that have been KYC'd, that they're not just Sybils, turns out to be really useful in the space, because it turns out Sybil attacks are a pain in the ass, right? Like when people can just manufacture millions of fake users, that messes up your system. And if you're limited to, say, the most being like the number of credit cards you have or number of passports and that you have, like it may be hard to still guarantee that a user can only create one account, but how many passports do you have? You can't create millions of accounts. And anyway, I think this thing of membranes, whether it's invitation codes to a private group like a Slack team or some sort of social triangulation or from users with certain types of reputation or whatever, will end up turning out to be useful and will be part of how you keep those kinds of crawlers out. And if you use HoloVault, I don't see Philip anymore, but if you use HoloVault for holding your information and that kind of thing, where users control their own information, then they don't need to leak that information a lot in a way that crawlers could access it. So creates a different space.
Cool. So I think I'm ready to ask what I think might be a wrap-up question, which is, where did it go? Oh, this person says, I totally believe in your cause. How can we help you? Where are you getting stuck? Is there anything that you feel is stuck? And through the telephone game, we could get it unstuck.
Well, there are some places where I have ended up feeling a little stuck, where I think we have run into some things. It doesn't mean it's a dead end. It just means it's something that we spend time on that we wish we wouldn't. like for me, the peer-to-peer communications tools for um, piercing network topologies, NATs and firewalls, HTTP masquerading. It seems like every blockchain and every peer-to-peer app out there needs these things and should be using these things. And I don't want us to be the ones to maintain that as whatever, as new firewall rules come into play or new network protocols or whatever. So like that's an example of a domain where I wish we weren't having to burn any of our hours. And it's part of why we were trying to use libp2p and go to a group that had had a very active community of developers and team up with them. We still may be able to use some parts of this. We're still looking at things we'd be able to reuse. We're looking at Crust from MadeSafe, which is a Rust-based communications framework potentially just for the NAT and firewall stuff. So that's an example of some of the things that we run into. We will need security audits. We will need people trying to break things, trying to crack things, trying to attack things. And that's part of why we want to enter into an alpha testing period fairly soon for Holo. We will need code review, both of our code, but of other codes. Like we will have an app store bridged with a sort of developer side of the app store, that may even be a little bit like our own decentralized GitHub. But we will need people to review other apps. We've got some leads on groups that actually like to do crowd finding of bugs and stuff like that. There's a group called Bug Crowd, and but we can't both grow the ecosystem as fast as we want to and like police the ecosystem, right? Like that's something where we're going to need to be a self-organizing, self-managing, self-policing community, if you will. Other things. I'm wondering, Paul, or is Connor still on? I don't see. Oh yeah, Connor's still on. Wondering if you guys know of other things that you can say that we need. We actually get a pretty supportive and active community in our chat spaces. It seems like a lot of people provide each other tech support on our chat channels, and we need help with documentation for sure. As you're finding things that are inadequately documented or errors, or if you even want to just, as you figure things out, help document things. And build cool apps.
I can say something.
Great.
As this is a journey that at least I have, probably Connor and a number of our developers have gone through. Is as we learn more things, we start wanting to share it with others. So if you want to show up in the spaces where we exist, like Mattermost and Reddit and now Stack Overflow, and just support other developers as you're learning things yourself, become sort of a teacher learner, I think that would help to grow the developer ecosystem and make us able to reach more people than our small team would be able to by ourselves.
Yep. I want to echo what Paul said in making more materials so that other people can learn to build on Holochain. If you're finding yourself stuck and you make a tool that makes it easy for you to get unstuck, share it forth, please, because we got a lot more people coming. That's really what we need. And then also, I mentioned this on the call that we had yesterday, and a bunch of hands went up of enthusiastic folks that want to hold meetups, but we need people to hold meetups and spaces for other people to learn about Holochain, so you can tell other developers and app owners about it so that they can get excited about it and have local groups to play together and build together.
Yeah, so I do want to talk about more next steps. And I'm just wondering, Art, if there's anything else before we wrap up into next steps that with this group of developers, anything else you want to make sure that people know or are walking away with?
Well, I want to thank you for being guinea pigs and, letting us try out something extremely fresh and unproven, with you. It's been an approach of ours actually from the outset to try to do some of that. I mean, we only coded Holochain for 2 months before we had our first hackathon, and that was like a friendly only, like people we knew that we invited and wouldn't be too hard on us. And but for us, like getting it in your hands and getting your feedback is so vital. And it's like what makes it real. It's part of why I like doing hackathons, is because it lets me actually get out there with people building things. And yeah, so thanks for letting us do that, even though it's unfinished around the edges or even in the center in some parts.
Yeah, thank you. So I do, just to go back to some of the things of what to expect next. So the content for this DevCamp is set to be available for 2 weeks after today. If you all would find it beneficial, we can leave this open to you for 30 days. Would that be better? So you can keep accessing some of the tools and the sample. Yeah. Okay. I'll go ahead and do that. And then I think a lot of the content that is in there, well, some of it is set up to be downloadable and some of it is not, because so much of it is actually pointing to places on our Git repo. A lot of that will just continue to be available. We will be doing another DevCamp sometime in January or February. And everything that we've been learning from all of you about what makes this more engaging and beneficial and valuable is what will continue to apply towards the next DevCamp. So keep an eye out for that. And then I think back to what Bear was saying in terms of some of the ways that we want to engage with people. He is definitely the guy to connect with around meetups and future hackathons, because he's really holding a lot of that space. And then Paul is just one of our community managers in terms of our online communities, but obviously he's a great guy and he's a great person to connect with around like where should you be participating and what is happening in some of those different spaces. And then Connor is really our king of documentation. And so if you, I just made that up. I don't know how he feels about being called a king of anything. But if you have questions, suggestions, ideas regarding developer.holochain.org, then he is really the go-to for that. And Eric, Bear, what else do you want to say about, I have more to say about some DevCamp next steps, and then I'll turn it over to you. But there's a final quiz for the DevCamp. That final quiz should now be available to you, and completing that final quiz successfully is what will give you your fancy certified Holochain developer certificate. So there's info about that, and just the construct for how to take that quiz is available in the DevCamp content for day 5. There's also a follow-up quiz that is available through the DevCamp content, and we actually read all of the things that you say in the follow-up quiz. So know that it really is helpful for us to have a way of looking at feedback from you all as a whole. And we have also scheduled and we'll be sharing the date for a follow-up feedback conversation, so that you're not just like keyboard catting about it, but we can actually have a face-to-face conversation in another Zoom call next week. So that'll give you some time to sort of marinate on all of the content and things that you might want to share with us about moving forward with DevCamps specifically. And then I think that's all I want to say about wrapping up the DevCamp content. Bear, now I want to go to you to talk about other future ways of engaging and building our community.
Great. Thanks, Vicky. So we had about 12 or 13 people show up yesterday on the call to go over the growth strategy and to get to know each other a little bit more and see who's showing up. And it seemed like it was valuable. There was a lot of energy there that was really exciting. And I want to do a follow-up session just in carrying forward what Art was saying about this being a trial. We're learning by doing. That I want to have a follow-up session next Monday. We'll do this time again next Monday. For anyone who wants to share, I mean, you have the experience, you're in the training, you do the thing, it's intense, and then afterwards it's not. So I want to find out what's sticking with you afterwards, what you would like in terms of support moving forward. If you're having trouble connecting to the community, or if there's anything to follow up with, if you have any questions that show up after a few days of reflection, as often happens, there'll be a space for that and to move things forward and see where everyone is. So raise your hand if you'd be interested in attending that session. Great. Fabulous. I hope to see you there. And just want to say thank you again to all of you for participating. This has just been a really wonderful thing, and just great signaling to see such a competent, skilled, and deeply motivated and visionary group of people coming together to get on board and create really radical stuff. So thank you all.
Yeah, I just want to echo that. And one of the things that Bear and I have been chatting about is all of the ways that we want to continue engaging with you all, especially as we get further along in the technology, but also further along in our shared understanding about what it is that we're trying to create here together and what some of those opportunities really are. And we have been running a developer internship program for a couple of sessions, but we are going to be shifting just the structure for that slightly, and are looking at fun ways of engaging all of you who are our early adopters in building stuff in Holochain, in some more engaging deep dive sort of events, both online and in person. So just know that we are excited and listening, and really looking to adapt how it is that we're engaging with the community as time progresses. And so you're going to be some of the first people that we come to say, hey, come do this fun thing with us. Cool.
Yeah, we've got some really fun things like on deck that we're not talking
so hard
about yet.
for me not to
we're going to invite you.
But we will. And is there anything else from you, Art, or Connor, or Paul, or Micah before we wrap up? Okay. Well, you all are awesome. Thank you so much. And we look forward to the next things. Bye.
Bye.